If you were standing in Constantinople in the year 532, you might have assumed the most dangerous thing in the city was the army, or the emperor, or the borders of the empire itself. But you would have been wrong. The most dangerous force in Constantinople did not carry swords, it wore colors, blue and green. The Hippodrome of Constantinople was not just a stadium, it was the emotional center of an empire. Racing teams competed here, but they were not just sports clubs, they were political identities, social networks, street-level expressions of frustration, loyalty, and identity. Think of football supporters, then add imperial politics, then remove modern safety regulations. By the time of Emperor Justinian, two factions dominated the city, the Blues and the Greens. On paper, they were racing teams. In practice, they represented layers of society that rarely agreed on anything else. Tax policy, local governance, religious disputes, even access to imperial favor. The races were just the stage. The real contest was underneath, and Justinian knew this better than anyone. He inherited an empire that was still wealthy, still powerful, but internally tense. Taxes were high, the state was ambitious, and ambition, as history repeatedly proves, is expensive. Justinian had big plans, reforming laws, reclaiming lost Western territories, rebuilding Roman authority in the Mediterranean, but all of that required money. And money had to come from somewhere, preferably from people who would rather not give it. Which is where things start to get politically sensitive. Because in Constantinople, dissatisfaction rarely stayed quiet. It went to the Hippodrome. On race days, the emperor didn't just attend for entertainment, he attended because the Hippodrome was one of the few places where the entire city spoke at once. And what they said mattered, because it wasn't just cheering, it was communication, approval, disapproval, warning, sometimes all three at once. And then came January 532, a moment that began, like many disasters in history, with bureaucracy. After a series of disturbances in the city, several members of both factions were arrested. Some were sentenced to execution, others were imprisoned, but something unusual happened. Two of the condemned men, one blue, one green, were scheduled for execution, but the execution did not go smoothly. The executioners failed, the men survived, and were taken to a monastery for temporary safety. In hindsight, this would have been a good moment for everyone to calm down. They did not. On the day of the next races, the crowd came to the Hippodrome already restless. They wanted answers. They wanted justice, and most importantly, they wanted to be heard. So they began to chant. A single word, a demand, a warning. Nika. Nika means conquer. But in that moment, it meant something closer to act. At first, this was familiar. Crowds in Constantinople shouted at emperors regularly. Sometimes it ended with policy changes, sometimes with apologies, sometimes with arrests. But this time, it did not stop. The crowd broke, not into silence, into movement. Rioting began at the Hippodrome and spilled into the streets. Buildings were burned, officials were attacked. The city, usually carefully controlled by imperial administration, began to slip. And once a city like Constantinople starts slipping, it does not do so gently. Within hours, the situation stopped being a protest and became something far more dangerous, a collapse of order. Justinian now faced a problem emperors fear more than war. Not an invading army, not a border crisis, but his own city. And it was not asking for negotiation anymore, it was asking for removal. Once the rioting escaped the Hippodrome, it spread with astonishing speed. The narrow streets of Constantinople became impossible to control. Groups formed, separated, merged again, some attacked government officials, others turned their anger towards symbols of imperial authority, and before long, fires began appearing across the city. Fire was one of the greatest dangers in any medieval city. Buildings stood close together, many were constructed with timber. Strong winter winds could carry flames from one street to the next in a matter of minutes. What began as scattered acts of destruction soon threatened entire districts. The capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was burning. Among the buildings destroyed was the Church of Hagia Sophia, not the magnificent cathedral that survives today. That would come later. The church standing in 532 was consumed by the chaos, along with public baths, government buildings, and large sections of the city center. By now, this was no longer about two imprisoned men. History has a habit of doing that. Small grievances have an extraordinary talent for uncovering much larger problems. Justinian attempted to restore order, messengers were sent, concessions were discussed, Officials tried to calm the crowds, but something fundamental had changed. The emperor was no longer setting the pace. The crowd was. For several days, Constantinople existed in an uneasy state between government and anarchy. The imperial administration still functioned. Technically, the emperor still occupied his palace. Technically, but beyond its walls, authority was evaporating. When enough people stop obeying at the same time, even the most powerful government begins to look surprisingly fragile. Then came an even greater shock. The blues and the greens, enemies for years, found themselves united. Not because they had settled their differences, because they had discovered something they disliked even more: the imperial government. That alliance was almost certainly temporary. It wouldn't survive the crisis, but for Justinian, it was a nightmare. His greatest political advantage had always been division. Now, the divisions had disappeared, at least for the moment. The crowds were no longer shouting about justice for 2 prisoners, they were questioning the emperor himself. Some demanded the dismissal of unpopular officials. Justinian complied. The respected legal official Tribonian, whose reforms had angered many powerful interests, was removed. The urban prefect was dismissed. Other senior figures lost their positions. Under normal circumstances, such concessions might have calmed the situation. This time, they barely slowed it. History often reaches a point where every concession creates a new expectation. Once authority begins retreating, people naturally wonder how much further it will retreat. Then the crisis crossed a line from riot to revolution. A new emperor was proposed. His name was Hypatius. Hypatius wasn't leading the uprising. If anything, contemporary accounts suggest he was reluctant to become involved. He was a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius, and therefore possessed something incredibly valuable in Roman politics. A legitimate claim, or at least a believable one. The writers needed a figurehead. Hypatius became that figurehead, whether he wanted the role or not. As support gathered around him, the crisis transformed completely. This was no longer an angry city demanding change. It was beginning to resemble an attempt to replace the emperor. And that is a very dangerous moment in any monarchy. Because once another candidate exists, the argument is no longer about policy, it's about survival. Inside the Great Palace, Justinian received increasingly grim reports. The fires continued, much of the city lay in ruins, a rival claimant had emerged, loyalty among officials was becoming uncertain, the Imperial Guard could not guarantee control of the streets. For perhaps the first time in his reign, the emperor began to consider the unthinkable: leaving Constantinople. From a purely practical perspective, retreat made sense. An emperor who escaped could raise another army. An emperor trapped inside a captured capital could not. Preparations quietly began. The empire's future seemed ready to sail away. And then one person stood up. Not a general, not a senator, not a priest, the empress, Theodora. Centuries later, historians would remember many things about the Nika riots, the fires, the destruction, the thousands gathered in the hippodrome, but before any of that could reach its conclusion, the future of the Roman Empire rested on a single conversation inside the imperial palace, and one woman was about to change it. Inside the Great Palace, the mood had changed completely. Just days earlier, Justinian had ruled the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. Now, his capital was burning. A rival emperor had been proclaimed, the streets belonged to the mob, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, tens of thousands of voices continued chanting, "Nika, conquer!" For perhaps the first time in his reign, Justinian wasn't planning how to rule, he was deciding whether he could survive. From a military perspective, retreat had its advantages. The emperor still possessed loyal armies elsewhere in the empire. If he escaped Constantinople, he might one day return. Roman emperors had recovered from setbacks before. History offered plenty of examples. There was no shame in surviving today if it meant reclaiming power tomorrow. At least, that was one way of looking at it. Then the Empress Theodora spoke. We should pause here for a moment. The speech that survives comes from the historian Procopius, writing after the events. Like many ancient historians, Procopius often reconstructed speeches to capture what he believed their message had been, rather than recording every word exactly as spoken. So, we can't know whether these were Theodora's precise words, but if Procopius is even close, they changed history. According to Procopius, Theodora rejected the idea of fleeing. She argued that exile might preserve life, but not dignity. Then came the line history is remembered for almost 1,500 years. Royal purple makes the finest burial shroud. In other words, if she was going to die, she would rather die as empress than live as a fugitive. Whether those were her exact words or Procopius's literary interpretation almost matters less than what happened next, because Justinian stayed. That decision changed everything. Running would have handed Constantinople to the rioters. Staying meant gambling the entire empire on one final attempt to regain control. Fortunately for Justinian, he possessed two exceptional commanders, Belisarius and Mundus. Belisarius is often remembered as one of the greatest generals of the Byzantine Empire. In later years, he would reconquer huge parts of the former Western Roman Empire. But before any of those campaigns, he faced a challenge much closer to home: his own capital. By now, much of the unrest had concentrated around the Hippodrome. The same arena that had once hosted thrilling chariot races had become the center of an attempted revolution. Thousands gathered inside, some expecting speeches, others expecting the formal proclamation of Hypatius as emperor. Few expected what came next. Justinian's commanders moved quickly. Belisarius approached with loyal troops. Mundus advanced from another direction. Another trusted officer, Narses, is described by Procopius as playing a crucial role earlier in the crisis by exploiting divisions among the Blues, reportedly persuading many to abandon the uprising with promises of imperial favor and reminders of old loyalties. Whether that alone changed the course of events is debated, but it illustrates an important point. The empire wasn't relying solely on swords, it was using politics until the very last moment. Empires rarely survive through military strength alone. They survive because someone knows exactly when to negotiate, and exactly when to stop negotiating. Then, negotiation ended. Imperial soldiers entered the Hippodrome. What followed was brutal. Procopius claims around 30,000 people were killed. It's one of the most frequently quoted figures associated with the Nika riots. Modern historians generally agree that the massacre was enormous. Whether the exact number reached 30,000 is impossible to verify. Ancient casualty figures are often estimates rather than careful counts, even if the true figures were lower. The scale of the bloodshed remains staggering. Within hours, the uprising had collapsed. Hypatius was captured. Despite reportedly having played a reluctant role in becoming the rebels' figurehead, he was executed. The city that had seemed on the verge of overthrowing an emperor had been brought back under imperial control at an extraordinary human cost. Justinian had kept his crown. Now he faced a different challenge: rebuilding a city, and ensuring nobody would ever come this close to removing him again. When the smoke finally cleared, Constantinople was almost unrecognizable. Entire districts had been reduced to ash. Government buildings lay in ruins. Thousands were dead. The Hippodrome, once filled with cheers for victorious charioteers, had become synonymous with one of the bloodiest days in Byzantine history. The Nika riots were over. The consequences were only beginning. For Justinian, survival created an unexpected opportunity. Much of the city needed rebuilding. That meant he could rebuild it on his own terms. One project would come to symbolize that recovery more than any other: the Hagia Sophia. The church destroyed during the riots was replaced with something far more ambitious. Justinian ordered the construction of a cathedral unlike anything the Christian world had seen. Completed in under just 6 years, the new Hagia Sophia stunned contemporaries with its immense dome, shimmering mosaics, and engineering that seemed to defy gravity. According to later tradition, Justinian is said to have declared, "Solomon, I've surpassed thee." Whether those were his exact words is uncertain, but the sentiment captures the confidence of a ruler who believed his empire had emerged stronger from catastrophe. And remarkably, he wasn't entirely wrong. The failure of the revolt left Justinian's political opponents weakened. Many influential critics had been killed, exiled, or stripped of their power. The emperor's authority, which had seemed so fragile only days earlier, became far more secure. Ironically, the greatest threat to his reign ended up strengthening it. History has a habit of enjoying that sort of contradiction. With Constantinople under control once again, Justinian returned to the ambitions that had defined his reign from the beginning. His legal reforms continued, culminating in what we now call the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental compilation and clarification of Roman law that would influence legal systems across Europe for centuries. His generals marched west. Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, then much of Italy from the Ostrogoths. For a brief moment, the dream of restoring the Roman Empire looked almost achievable. Had Justinian fled Constantinople in January 532, history might have remembered him very differently. That's one of the reasons historians continue returning to the Nika riots. Not simply because they were dramatic, but because they represent one of those rare moments where history appears balanced on the edge of a knife. If Justinian leaves the city, does the Byzantine Empire fragment? Does Belisarius ever launch his famous campaigns? Is the Hagia Sophia ever built? Does Roman law spread in quite the same way across medieval Europe? We'll never know. History only gives us the path that was taken, not the ones left behind. The biggest turning points in history often don't feel inevitable while they're happening, only afterwards do they seem obvious. There is another reason the Nika riots deserve to be remembered. At first glance, they're easy to dismiss: a sports riot, a few angry fans, an unusually bad day at the races. Except they weren't. The chariots were simply the stage. The real story was about politics, taxation, power, public frustration, imperial authority, and what happens when ordinary people decide they no longer recognize the government's right to command them. History remembered the colors. It almost forgot the causes. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of the Nika riots. History rarely explodes without warning. Long before buildings burn, pressure builds. Long before crowds gather, trust begins to erode. And long before an empire nearly collapses, small decisions quietly accumulate beneath the surface. When the explosion finally comes, it's easy to mistake the spark for the cause. If you'd visited Constantinople a year later, you would have seen a city rebuilding itself, markets busy once again, ships arriving from every corner of the Mediterranean, the new Hagia Sophia climbing ever higher above the skyline. You might never have guessed that only months earlier, an emperor had been preparing to flee, or that an empire had come within a single decision of taking a completely different course. That's what makes history so compelling. The moments that seem inevitable in hindsight almost never felt inevitable to the people living through them. The Nika riots are often remembered for one word: Nika, conquer. But history's greatest irony is this: no one truly conquered. Not the blues, not the grains, not even Justinian. The city paid the price, and Constantinople carried the scars for generations.